Did you know that the dose makes the poison? Yes, in the 16th century, a Swiss physician and an alchemist named Paracelsus, also known as the father of toxicology, said, "All things are poison, and nothing is without poison. Only the dose makes a thing, not a poison." I'm Rekha Pasupuleti. I'm a toxicologist in the Human Health Assessment aka HHA branch of DPR. I welcome you all on behalf of the HHA team. Ever wonder what HHA does? All those scientists publishing very long documents? Does it seem too tedious to comprehend? Have no fear, because we will demystify it for you right here and right now. Okay, let's get started. Ta-da! We will now follow the path of this glamorous and colorful new active ingredient, a small molecule called allyl isothiocyanate or AITC, as it travels through HHA for its evaluation as a new fumigant. Let's watch what happens when AITC first goes to the active ingredient section. Off you go, AITC.
Thanks, Rekha. Hi, everyone. I'm Erin Collitz, and I'm an associate toxicologist with the active ingredient section of HHA. And this is AITC. Now, this little molecule is produced by plants in the mustard family as a defense against herbivores, and it is also what gives wasabi that special little kick. So what do we look for when we evaluate a pesticide, and how do we do it? Well, it can depend a little bit on the pesticide, but they all share common study requirements. For example, we reviewed 33 studies with AITC for human health effects that covered a wide range of endpoints, and yet all of these studies were required to meet very specific federal and state standards. We first looked at a group of short-term single exposure studies called acute toxicity studies. Now, these are really important because they give us the first clues of the potential health effects of the following exposure to the pesticide, and the results of these studies are used to determine the label requirements for that product. Some other toxicity studies that occur over a longer duration provide information on what happens if an animal is exposed repeatedly to the pesticide over a specific period of time. Now, some of these studies look at very specific concerns, such as the potential to cause cancer, to harm your nervous system, to induce DNA damage, and even the effects of exposure on fetal growth and development. And the results of all of these studies are helpful in establishing safety criteria for humans. For AITC, we recommended that AITC undergo a comprehensive risk assessment prior to registration, which is the department policy for fumigants. Afterwards, AITC was forwarded to the exposure assessment section. But first, Niladri is going to tell you a little bit about what the product formulation section does once an active ingredient is registered in California. Take it away, Niladri.
Oh, thank you, Erin. Hi everyone, I am Niladri Bhaumik, Associate Toxicologist with the Product Formulation section of HHA. You came to know from Erin that AITC is not currently registered in California, so it is evaluated by the active ingredients section. If AITC was registered, then new formulations containing it will be evaluated by our section. Let me briefly discuss what we do in the product formulation section. We evaluate acute toxicity studies on formulated products like this one. These studies identify health hazards from short-term exposure to the products by specific routes, such as by ingesting it or by getting it on your skin. For example, what would happen if you inhale this disinfectant product or accidentally get it in your eye? We primarily evaluate the 6-pack group of studies that consists of acute oral, dermal, and inhalation toxicity, primary eye and dermal irritation, and dermal sensitization studies. Once we look at all the data and identify the hazards of the product, we assign toxicity categories 1 to 4, 1 being the most toxic. Based on these, we can determine if the signal words, precautionary statements, and first aid statements on the product label are adequate, like right here in the product label for this product. For agricultural products, we also determine the appropriate restricted entry interval, and personal protective equipment or PPE. Following our review, we submit our evaluations to the registration branch. However, In some cases, we might ask our HHA colleagues for additional help with risk assessment or exposure depending on the product. Now over to my friend Wayne to tell us what happens in the exposure assessment section. Here you go, team.
Hello everyone, my name is Wei Ying Jiang and I work in the exposure assessment section of HHA as a staff toxicologist. My colleagues and I evaluate all exposure scenarios for pesticides. We also develop exposure estimates and prepare exposure assessment documents for human health risk assessment. The registrants wants to use AITC as an agricultural fumigant in California. Because of that, we focused on inhalation exposures, like what happens to handlers working on AITC applications or re-entry workers who enter AITC treated field after applications, or even occupational bystanders who may be working in a nearby field. Plus, we want to protect residential bystanders who live near where AITC may be applied. Overall, we looked at 93 different exposure scenarios, and for each of them, we evaluated 4 different exposure periods: short-term, lasting less than 7 days; intermediate, which is from 7 days to a year, as well as annual and lifetime exposures. Since AITC is not registered in California, we do not have any use data. What we did instead was to predict where and how AITC would be used based on other soil fumigants on similar crops and to control similar pests. We also used air dispersion modeling to estimate the concentrations of AITC around a treated field to help us estimate the bystander exposures. Once we finished our exposure estimates, they were combined with the toxicity endpoints generated by the risk assessment section, as well as the toxicology and dose response assessment section to complete the risk assessment process. Here is Mitra to give you more details about that.
Hi everyone, I'm Mitra Geyer and I'm an associate toxicologist in the toxicology and dose response assessment section. Before we can begin the risk assessment process, we must first be certain that we have compiled all available toxicity data on AITC. That's where my section comes in. In addition to the registrant submitted studies reviewed by our colleagues in the active ingredients section, we perform a systematic review of all publicly available scientific literature on an active ingredient, scouring online databases and regulatory documents. We leave no stone unturned. This one was trying to hide, but we found it. We always find it. Once we have compiled all the available literature, we filter it down to the studies that are relevant to human health risk assessment. For AITC, this meant reviewing over 2,000 documents. These didn't end up being relevant. Then we analyze, model, and summarize the data so that the risk assessor can have one place to review all relevant data as they make decisions. Now the data is ready for Putapa to begin the risk assessment.
Thank you, Mitra. Hi everyone, I am Putapa Dodmane, staff toxicologist in the risk assessment section within the human health assessment branch. One of the biggest projects in our branch is to develop risk characterization documents. These documents take final shape in our section. Main goal of these documents is to determine if there is a potential health risk for workers or bystanders when they are exposed to a pesticide. In the risk assessment field, our main mantra is dose makes the poison, where we aim to identify a dose or a concentration that should not show toxic effects. For developing risk characterization documents, we critically evaluate the studies that are compiled, reviewed, and analyzed by our colleagues, as you heard in the previous segments. Ultimately, to identify a no observed effect level, which we call it as NOEL, for any pesticides or any chemicals for different durations of exposure. For AITC, we estimated NOELs for acute, subchronic, and chronic durations using animal studies. We even dug up studies that used horseradish extract, which has very high levels of AITC, more than 80 to 80%. Once we have the NOELs, the uncertainty factors, and the exposure numbers, the next step is to estimate the risk. You might ask how we express the risk. We express the risk by calculating what we call margin of exposure, which is basically ratio of NOEL to the exposure numbers. For any scenarios when the calculated margin of exposure is less than the target margin of exposure, then we consider that scenario to be of potential health risk. This is how, using margin of exposure concept, we have evaluated numerous exposure scenarios for AITC in our draft risk characterization document. Ultimately, our risk characterization documents support department's mission to protect public health while allowing pesticide use for controlling pests. That's all for now from risk assessment section.
Hi, I'm Anna Kalashnikova, a staff toxicologist in risk assessment section in HHA. Besides these detailed evaluations of pesticides, HHA supports many other DPR activities, such as registration, mitigation, and enforcement. For example, HHA provides guidance to the Bureau of Cannabis Control, the state cannabis governing authority, on testing for pesticides in cannabis products. HHA also reviews the toxicity of illegal pesticides found on fresh produce sampled by enforcement branch. We help by determining whether residues pose a potential acute health risk to the consumers of this produce. HHA also helps investigate thrift incidents, accidental exposures, or other activities where human health may have been harmed. Everything you heard today is a part of the role that HHA plays in our department's mission.
All this glitter and glamour, no wonder you got so much attention. So, how was it? Amazing, isn't it? We hope by now you have an understanding of what HHA is all about, how each section plays a critical role in the detailed evaluation of pesticides. If you have any questions, please contact any one of us by email and we will be happy to answer. I hope we all can meet in person very soon. But until then, please stay safe and stay well. Thank you and bye.